Everyone wake up, Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth is finally on PC. For today's video, I'll be discussing how the game runs, how it feels, and I didn't actually get to talk about why I really do love this game. This will be a spoiler-free video. Feel free to stay. There will be out-of-context footage being shown in this review, and if you're not fine by that, then feel free to click off or just hear the audio of the commentary. I do want to note that I haven't gotten through the whole game just yet, so I don't know if there would be certain areas in Rebirth, whether it does function or not. So far, my experience has been great, but if there are certain issues and you have progressed pretty far in this game, feel free to comment down below, and so that other users can know about these issues. To those who are new, I typically like to review games once I fully complete them, but this is somewhat of a different case since I did finish this game on the PS5, and it takes a good chunk of your time if you're going to involve yourself in every single part of the game. Regardless, it's a fun video game still, and I do believe it is the definitive way to experience Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth. Shout out to Square Enix for being kind and providing me with a free code to play this on my PC. I would have bought and played this regardless since it's Final Fantasy 7, and its remake series have been doing great to me. Without further ado, let's dive into one of my favorite games of all time. Back in 2020, when Final Fantasy 7 Remake was first released, it was one of my greatest gaming experiences of all time. I didn't necessarily grow up playing the OG FF7, neither have I finished it, but I was completely aware of the series and how it's a big involvement in one of the games I truly love, which is Kingdom Hearts. So I was bound to really get into the Final Fantasy franchise when I was younger. I did also end up watching FF7's movie, Advent Children, and I love that movie. I know that's probably a hot take to say on the internet, but it was such a good closure for the FF7 series. Anyway, enough of me gushing over FF7. Since this is a spoiler-free video, I'm not gonna bother to speak about the story. It's also a sequel, which I assume many of you have played part 1 and just want to be surprised about its story. If you are new and you're coming into this, first of all, you should be investing your time into playing part 1. Second of all, good luck trying to understand the story and the layers of it, but from a video game standpoint, it is really fun to play compared to the first. I still do think part 1 holds up well and you should begin there, but hey, you choose where you want to invest in, just don't be complaining about story structure. I also made a video discussing its recent update to part 1, where it is catered to newcomers, where you could go through the game quickly by enabling a mode that is offered when you start a new game, if you just want to understand things and hop straight into Rebirth. I don't advise new players to do that, since you should take your time when getting into these games, but it is there and it is used for people who want to do that. I have a video that covers it, so check it out if you're curious about it. To those who have played part 1, this is a really big improvement compared to the first. It really shows a lot in terms of its gameplay design. The systems implemented in it have been great to say the least. If you had complaints about part 1 in terms of its gameplay, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the issues are resolved here, except for the lack of Materia loadouts, which I will talk about soon. My personal issue with Final Fantasy VII Remake is not because of its linearity for the level design, since there are clearly times in part 1 where you can roam around and take upon different content of the game. I always criticize how we couldn't really have more immersive content, like having to experience your party members' side quests that has more story of their characters, playing minigames with them, or creating important decision making that will determine a story's outcome in your playthrough. Since that does exist in part 1, where certain decision making you do in your playthrough does affect certain scenes or a big story moment, I remember saying something along the lines where The Witcher 3 has a lot of this, which creates a dynamic between the player and the game where it does really feel like that your decisions do matter, and having these customized playthroughs based off of your decisions really create these experiences unique. I wanted Final Fantasy VII Remake to go through that route since this game was immersive to an extent, and it can do that if they really bothered to do it. Although FF7 Rebirth didn't necessarily create a game that is on par to The Witcher 3, and how they create their decision making, it is kind of there on having that experience. They did add an affinity leveling system with your party members where, depending on how deep your bond is to them, you get to see an exclusive scene with them later on in the story. There are many of these scenes in here depending how you leveled their affinity. A lot of it is around the gameplay loop, which was surprising when I first understood how it worked. What I mean by that is on what you do in the gameplay during combat, which is the synergy attacks or the tag team attacks for those who don't know, doing side quests with a certain certain party member, interacting with them in the overworld, since there is additional dialogue or conversations that you can miss with your party members throughout the game, and certain decision making in the main story can increase affinity for your party members and will give you a result later on in the game. Although it is quite unique to create this system based off your passive actions throughout your playthrough. This is horrible for those who don't want to experience these certain results. There's also romance in the game between Aerith and Tifa. You could still obviously pursue and make these decisions to romance whoever, but sometimes for whatever reason, if they are not on the high affinity level compared to the other party members where they do have high affinity, you are not going to experience these things for the story, which can completely throw off this immersion you have. Happened to me where my playthrough was Tifa focused and I ended up having Aerith, which threw off the character development for the party members that I've seen in my playthrough. I wish I could go more in depth about this system and how it was structured, but that will reveal more spoilers. Even though I didn't experience certain things in my playthrough, I was glad I was able to see how things turned out for these characters. I also do want to point out that yes, you have certain story scenes with your other party members based on their affinity, if your affinity level is not high with Tifa and Aerith. Now, since that's out of the way, let's talk about the gameplay's combat. If you've been following the channel, I always talk about and love how combat mechanics are in video games. To me, that's what makes the main dish for a video game. As you know, I already loved the Part 1 remake and I was amazed with how the combat was. Of course it wasn't perfect, but the amount of technicality you could do in Part 1 was already good enough. The team in Square Enix decided to even up the combat more in Rebirth by adding more mechanics, such as perfect blocking where you couldn't get damaged. You could also stun the enemy when perfect blocking, and it helps to create an opening to attack. Another one was how you're able to passively parry and counter with Cloud. Before you wouldn't need to have an ability, but now it's a passive combat ability that you could use right in the start of the game. I'm not sure if other characters have the same technique as Cloud, but any character can defensively play as well. A nice addition that they decide to slap on for the party members are the tag team abilities you have with them, whether it is passive or has a flashy command attack to it. Typically, if it is a passive synergy ability, you are able to do a tag team combo on the enemy or able to use it for defensive purposes. The input happens immediately, so you could use this whenever you want as long as your party member is still up or not stuck on an animation of whatever attack they are doing. This is very useful for comboing and putting much more creative and efficient damage to enemies or bosses. Like I said before, it's even used for defending each other depending on what scenario you are in. What makes this mechanic better is the synergy command attacks where you have a full-on animation with the other character. It's very flashy, but it does a lot of work towards these bosses or enemies, which creates wild fight scenes in this game. I love it a lot. Also, by the end of the synergy attack, there are bonuses you get for a short duration, which can be unlimited MP, which is the magic you could cast in this game, or the other bonuses after using a synergy attack. They also give buffs regarding your limit break, which is an ultimate attack for the character. There are plenty of other bonuses that synergy attacks utilize. I just can't think of them as of now, but these help a lot too with builds you're creating for your party. The fourth thing about what's new with this combat system is the air combat. There wasn't much air combat in Part 1, and the team made it much more interesting where it's rewarding to do air combat. Not every character can go in the air and combo, while some can. Although some party members can combat in the air, it does take some technique to have some air time, whether it's based on timing, use of synergy skills, or properly using your weapon. It's not only flashy, but it helps create openings for players to play more aggressively when they have the chance to. The rewards on learning these techniques goes a long way for your first playthrough. I love how they pretty much added fighting game mechanics in this hybrid of an action turn-based combat. You could even juggle enemies to maintain your combos, and coming back to Rebirth after nearly a year, the game reminded me that this just has all the sauce for animations, combat, music, and sound effects. Just check this out. This is only the beginning of the game.
That was awesome!
You think?
Hostile.
You're out!
Let's finish this. You're done. I got the rest. finish this. I'm high. You're done. We still have a long way to go.
That clip only showed basic mechanics along with basic mob fights. The combat expands more when you go out and fight tougher enemies, bosses, and expands greater when you have builds for your characters that hold certain materia to them. This game is not a hack and slash game, it's much more methodical, and you can't go out there expecting to win with just your attacks or combos. You actually need to forge builds for each character while understanding how enemy behavior is, along with knowing their vulnerabilities, if they are weak with a certain element or needs to be hit at a certain spot. Things of that nature where your knowledge of the game is much more important than everything else. I do want to point out that if the game does seem intimidating later on in your playthrough, you could always change the difficulty anytime. There's no punishment whatsoever for it. As much as they did a great job on refining their own combat system and has a variety of enemies and bosses to encounter, the biggest thing that they oddly missed is adding a feature for materia loadouts. Materia is very important in FF7 since they help you create builds. Adding materia to your weapons makes your characters have certain abilities or magic attached to them, since mainly casting magic is very important in Final Fantasy VII. Since the game is about 100 plus hours long, that's how much it took me when I did my first playthrough, it is really a hassle to constantly change materia builds for your party. You start to notice it a lot when you dive into fights in your playthrough, but more so obviously visible by the end game if you're trying to 100% complete it. By the end of the game, you go through many tough fights and some builds are not good enough. So there's a lot of trial and error as you learn what builds are viable against these fights. Unfortunately, I was really irritated as I was going for my platinum trophy back then on my PS5 playthrough because of how demanding it is of your time constantly creating new builds or just wanting to switch back to certain materia. I do hope maybe one day they do a live quality update where they can implement materia loadouts on their menu, but if you are trying to complete these fights by endgame without a guide, may God be with you. Another question you may be asking is how the open world is. I don't necessarily think it's any different from any open world game. Don't expect this game to be the Breath of the Wild for Final Fantasy. It really more so operates in open zones and creates tasks for you when you are exploring at certain zones. Back then, a lot of people have said that its design is unappealing since it's a Ubisoft open world game. You go out to do tasks and go to these towers to uncover the map more. The thing is, if the video game's overall gameplay is good, then I don't mind having more bits of gameplay. A lot of these scenarios are combat focused, which I didn't mind at all. That's how strong your combat is if the player is seeking more of the gameplay. And this also is a Final Fantasy game. Their worlds, environments, and characters are always something to look forward to. There are side quests implemented in this game, so you get to learn more about the place, the story, and characters that are involved with these quests. I do think you could reach a certain amount of burnout when you do the extra content of the game, which is important to always take a break and proceed with the story since you always come back to these things whenever. Personally, I like the open world aspect of this game since this is a big step up compared to a lot of the modern Final Fantasy games, since our last and decent or okay open world Final Fantasy game was 15. FF16 didn't offer an open world since it primarily focused itself on combat and heavily on its story. Although the overworld map doesn't feel as lively, the activities you can do within them can be fun to get into due to how it focuses on combat. The parts that do feel lively is when you're in the town hubs, which the devs seem to have a splendid time on. I just wish to see more of it during the open world parts of the game. One of the first main things you start to notice when free roaming around Rebirth is how clunky the game can feel when you're climbing, running, mantling over stuff. Things just don't feel natural when it comes to traversing the world, even riding on a chocobo. It's not a game breaker, but it is one of the main gameplay elements that you will be spending most of your time on. And as much as I am aware that they did say they spent developing for only about 3.5 years on this game, which is outstanding and unbelievable to see this type of quality in this type of game released so soon to the public in this day and age where many video games take a lot of time to make over like 4 years, and they got this done within 3.5. So yes, it's very surprising to see this game just pushed out and give us so much content and actually have quality to it. But you could definitely tell there are things when traversing within its open world where it does show how quick they made it, where it does diminish certain qualities to their mechanics or their gameplay. One of the major complaints of last year when the game released on the PS5 were the minigames. A lot of people didn't like how there were a lot of minigames, and to be honest with you, I didn't see a big issue with that since the minigames weren't hard the first time you tried it, neither do they require you to play the rest of their content. I do understand if people were genuinely interested in playing these minigames, but that's the point of this remake since they were present in the OG. How I see it is this game is not just about its combat, it's a lot of things. It's Final Fantasy VII, for goodness sake. It's one of the biggest RPGs in the late 90s, and they are replicating this wonderful experience in this modern era we live in. So to have a good to great quality game depending on what section you spend most of your time with, the beauty of this game is the amount of different things you can do. I was glad I was able to take a break from the combat and invest my time in other content of this game. As someone who 100% all the mini games in the first playthrough and had to deal with all the different difficulties to complete them, I could say that the devs took some time creating each minigame. Of course, some don't feel the greatest, but they are fun in their own way. I do think some of these minigames are overtuned with how difficult they can be if you are completing all of its content, but they are possible to do. I'm actually not quite sure if they ended up changing how things are balanced with the game in its entirety, but those were the issues I faced when playing some minigames. This is all the gameplay loop that you can experience along with the main story for about 100 plus hours if you really dig in deep with each content. As much as I had fun experiencing all the content provided for us players, the one criticism I can objectively give is that if you don't like a certain particular content, whether it is the combat or minigames, there is some FOMO to them if you don't bother to complete these certain tasks or quest lines. All the content that is provided in this game has a purpose, which have some branching storylines and give rewards when completing each one. I would say some are not as important, but I do think they give the aliveness of these maps you'll explore, and if you are someone who enjoys story or collecting items, get ready to eventually grind out this game. When I also talk about storylines, we legit have full-on cutscenes and dialogue for side content. I personally think this was great to have since it created much more incentive to do all the content in this game. I always felt that the game is never ending with the amount of things you can see. I do understand the other side of things where if you weren't interested, you would somewhat miss out on potential important pieces of the story. I do want to quickly talk about difficulty. This talk is more so for newcomers of the game. When starting your first playthrough, you are provided with 3 difficulty options: easy, normal, dynamic. I played on dynamic difficulty since I was already familiar with Remake's combat. With dynamic difficulty, the combat scales to your levels, so enemies or bosses don't quickly die compared to normal. If you want the game to push the combat a bit more, I highly recommend dynamic difficulty, where you can do more combos and push these combat systems further, because I just dislike when I play on normal and I can't do technical things that I want to execute. It was a good sweet spot for difficulty. The only weird thing about dynamic mode is how some fights really feel like you are playing on hard mode. I guess that's the con of having a difficulty that scales to your level. What's another weird thing, I don't know if this is a bug in the game when I first experienced it on the PS5, nor do I know if it still exists on PC, is how your difficulty scales every single thing in the game. What I mean by this is not every content is meant to have a difficulty. They should have their own set of difficulties. I noticed this when I was completing all the minigames, and there were clearly hard minigames to go through. On your first playthrough, the difficulty of certain minigames should be on normal or whatever they have designed it for. Since I was playing on dynamic difficulty, this was affecting my runs on minigames a lot. It made it to the point where it was impossible to complete. I decided to check if switching my difficulty to easy would have affected the results on what minigame I was stuck on, and it did by a lot, which is why I mentioned earlier that if you were stuck on any content of the game, feel free to switch the difficulty. Again, I'm not sure if it currently exists for this PC port, but keep that in mind if things don't go your way mathematically. Despite all the flaws, I was happy that I was able to sit down and just keep playing Final Fantasy VII. The amount of content you can invest in, along with having more story in this 100-hour journey, is a spectacular feeling. I'm even happier that I could have better performance and crispier quality in this PC port. I have endured and played on the PS5 version in its performance mode, and to be honest with you, it wasn't as bad for me. Of course, just like everyone else's complaint, it sucked that the performance mode's visual created a blurriness filter on it, so diving back into Rebirth's PC port was a surreal thing to see when the game is clear as day. I run an Nvidia 4070 Super as my GPU, and for the CPU, I have a AMD Ryzen 9 7900X. It's not what an average PC user has, and results may vary depending what CPU and GPU you have. My overall experience so far has not been bad. It's quite a step up from what I went through with the PS5. As soon as you open up the graphics settings, it's quite simple to navigate through and change up. It operates somewhat the same as Final Fantasy XVI's PC port, where you do have to rely on dynamic resolution to have better performance. It's just now you have the ability to modify how your dynamic resolution works. They offer minimal resolution and maximum resolution to change in your settings. I've upscaled the minimum resolution to 66%, while of course at maximum it's 100. If you're not familiar with what you're changing, the graphic presets are reliable to put on. I did play around with the dynamic resolution by putting minimum upscaling to 100%, and although the image looked nicer, it wasn't the best since my game was stuttering from time to time, which is why having it on 50% for minimum dynamic resolution is better for more of a stable frame rate. I only put it up to 66% to have that sweet spot. From what I noticed, depending on what I'm doing in the game or where I'm at, I do average around 85 to 150 frames, which isn't bad for it to run on ultra settings. I don't have these frame drop spikes during gameplay, and it still feels smooth as I play. Another important feature of this PC port is the AI upscaling with DLSS. This really changes how performance runs on this game and is the best part of it all. The worst thing about this PC port, and if you own a AMD GPU, it does not provide any FSR. It's one of those weird situations again with Square Enix that yes, it's amazing that they are branching out to expand their player base as they release their games on different gaming platforms. On the other hand, they are somewhat exclusive to a platform by not giving better performance to those who don't own an Nvidia GPU. So I do hope sometime down the line they can add FSR and be able to cater to other PC users who own AMD GPUs. This can hurt their releases if they don't bother to do so. I know a lot of people are curious if the graphic fidelity and lighting are drastic with PCs in comparison to consoles. To be brutally honest, I don't think there is a big difference on graphic fidelity unless you have a keen eye for these type of things, if we're not talking about resolution, performance of course. One of the major criticisms I had for the PS5 version was its lighting. The daytime lighting is overexposed in many parts of the game. This was somewhat an issue in Remake Part 1, but a lot of it is based during the nighttime or less lit areas in the game. It's more apparent in Rebirth since majority of the time you are free roaming during the day, so you will notice many areas that have overexposure on your screen. Although lighting is different when going through different places in this game, it still kind of suffers from too much lighting. So are console players really missing out on this port? Not necessarily, when visually these games on PS5 and PC are impressive in their own ways. I think it really shows how well the PS5 version held its own compared to PC. It's just you get even better quality out of the PC port. The only thing that's missing and would be great to have is frame generation. Final Fantasy XVI had it for their PC port and it really improved performance of their game, which I was even able to run the graphics higher than usual. It made my experience of Final Fantasy XVI much better than the PS5 by miles. There were night and day differences and improvements from that PC port compared to the PS5. Don't get me wrong about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on PC. It was already running well to begin with for what the team was working on. This definitely is the definitive way to play Rebirth if you have the right PC build for it. If you are really a diehard Final Fantasy VII fan, or if you already own a PS5 Pro, I think it's best to just continue playing on there or purchasing it if you want to experience better visuals and performance. I don't think there is really a need to go out, get a PC version of this game, or build a whole PC just to play it. Like I said, you would really need a keen eye to notice these things if you want to understand what everyone is talking about of having crispier quality. This wraps up my PC review of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. It is a solid port overall. Square Enix is definitely getting up there on creating better ports on PC. Their last really good port was Kingdom Hearts 3, and it looked amazing when I played through that game again. For the scale that Rebirth is in, it feels that it's not real on what we're experiencing. The dynamic resolution does kind of ruin the image from time to time depending on what it's set on, but you do need it on since the game was developed with this feature in mind due to the PS5. Other than that, I can't wait to go back and play more of it. I will upload a showcase of this game very soon. It will take some time as I want to record more footage of places you may not see yet in early stages of the game. No worries, I will not spoil the game, but I hope everyone looks forward to it. I'm signing off. Remember to drop a like and subscribe as I cover a variety of games like Final Fantasy. I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace and sweet dreams. We out.
But none with such a breathtaking view. Who could tire of it?
Everyone, eventually.
Man, I wish I could go on trips all over the world like you guys.
Trips. I think you mean business trips, which are no fun at all.
Though you do learn stuff on